Welcome to True North Project, a podcast that's equal parts sense-making, soul-searching, and storytelling. My name is Christian. Today, I have a conversation with Kodah Pipitone, who is an experienced executive and founder within consumer health technology, impact investment, and public health systems. Kodah is a rational futurist at the intersection of technology and design, and has woven a unique journey that integrates purpose, profit, planet, and people. Kodah is also a detransitioned trans woman, aka dude, gone chick, gone dude again. In this dialogos, we navigate through a wide range of topics, including clean energy and decarbonization technologies, the exploration of gender identity and the fluidity of gender, the impact of transitioning on communications and social dynamics, the ethical implications of gene therapy and the future of human augmentation, cultural roles for gender-expansive individuals, the impact of environmental factors like phthalates on biological development and cultural evolution, and the transition into the age of AI, future of humanity amidst technological advancements, potential of neural implants and gene therapies, etc. It was an amazing conversation. Kodah is a Jedi, modern Jedi. He's a fascinating individual, very intelligent, and I really enjoyed this conversation. And I always enjoy every time I get a chance to drop in with him. So hope you enjoyed as much as I did. You can support this podcast by subscribing. It's a great zero-cost way to support. Share with your friends. Leave us a 5-star review. Your support helps us, continue to bring better guests onto the show and make this juicier and juicier. Enjoy. Much love.
You asked me how I'm doing. So 20 minutes later, I think it's by way of warm up. I'm pretty good. I had an interesting development with this clean energy company commercially driven decarbonization. And they're really interested in bringing me either in-house or propping me up. And there's a lot there. And what I get from that is if I took that offer, an offer like this came last year. If I take that offer, then I can entrepreneur from security and stability as opposed to from survival. And my entrepreneurship feels so fun when I'm not requiring it to support my material stability. So I'm entertaining it and I actually feel really aligned with it. So so we're in that conversation. It's not as if I'd have a boss and be on a job. I'd be a partner in a new vehicle.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm looking at that as what's possible with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is a venture that's trying to decarbonize through enterprise. So give me an example of what you mean.
So they're an IP development, technology development company. They're publicly traded.
Mm-hmm.
And they've developed everything from advanced solar systems to hydrogen systems to biofuels to water treatment. And they got a whole library of real industry defining technologies that are better for the planet and better for the industries. And so they're therefore highly profitable. And they're and they love the kind of horizontal literacy that I have, across domains, and then how to build funds and how to build deals and how to structure companies. So there's it feels like I have a lot of growth in there, and it's very technical. But the technologies themselves are literally frontier deep tech. So I think this is an interesting, as far as an application of my genius, this could be an interesting focused building thing. While then I do my thought work, sense making, coaching, consulting, and whatnot as an entrepreneur, and under the umbrella of the think tank. And this even falls under the umbrella of the think tank.
Cool.
So it's my emergent intelligence suddenly is taking on a huge client that's going to make me a partner in one of the vehicles. So
Yeah,
all
that's
under
sick.
the umbrella of emergent intelligence. Yeah. So I've been sitting with that it's been a couple months brewing, but yesterday's conversation, I got really vulnerable and they were like, dude, we would love to create this conversation with you. So
Awesome. Well, I hope that works out. That's really exciting.
yeah.
So if we're in podcast mode,
Yeah.
we should not leave people behind. We should bring them along for the ride. So I want to give people a bit of some context. So
Yeah.
like, let's go from like the high level sweep from you, like say your last known position in the quote unquote matrix, right?
Mhm.
Or and like sort of that ride from you know going from there to here. In other words, you've been on a interesting journey that's taking you all over the place, both on the physical spectrum down to the jungle, et cetera, and also on the gender spectrum and this whole sort of like whirlwind that you've been on. So I'm curious about, and if we could, kind of bring people up to speed just so that I can get a better sense of like what
Yeah.
is informing your worldview now.
Yeah. I love it. Well, like to answer that, Kodah Pipitone, right? Grateful to be here on the Soul Quest podcast as the name
Well,
emerges in the
the True
conversation.
True North Project is the podcast, but
All right.
um, but Soul Quest is the thing. Yeah, we're dropping rabbit holes. Soul Quest. We can talk about Soul Quest later.
All right. Awesome. So I'm grateful to be here on the True North podcast. And yeah, as you just mentioned, Christian, I have taken many shapes throughout my adult life. And I think as far back as is relevant, did great in school, studied world religions and economics, ethics primarily, and then traveled. So lived in Japan, Hawaii, traveled the world on one-way plane tickets, but ended up working corporate in Japan at an English school, developing curriculum. Then came back and was thinking, and we can talk about the personal journey, but was thinking about ethics, impact, and justice. So in my early 20s, I was in that social justice frame of view on the world, hierarchies of oppression, and how to make structural changes to do good. And that led me to joining a worker cooperative that had a very interesting ownership model. So I became a business owner at a young age of $1 million revenue business, cafe, event space, restaurant, and bookstore. And it's called Red Emma's Worker Cooperative. Anti-authoritarian talks, presentations, and I was often the MC in those panels. And then I was building out the front of house. So buying and maintaining espresso machines, training staff, and sourcing coffee beans that we actually roasted ourselves. So I kind of came into that radical space first. And then from that, I looked around at the social justice landscape and saw the LGBTQ community was experiencing disproportionate hardship due to structural issues in social services, not serving them. And I first aggregated all of the nonprofits through my mentor, Brianna Jenkins, in what's called the Baltimore Transgender Alliance. We brought together all these organizations doing good in the world and helped them work together more efficiently and then ultimately interface with governments. And I did this for a while, speaking on a microphone, speaking motivation, being a healer. I never really identified as a victim, but I was in the ideology and the zeitgeist of oppression Olympics in a lot of ways. But I still had this structural impact and value creation foundation that I was operating through. So I shifted from what I quickly realized was a social networking game to find the right political families to support campaigns and achieve status and get in the rooms where the contracts were made for these nonprofits and tax havens and all this. I shifted out of that into building a software company to help social services do what they do better. I chose homeless services because their client management systems were underserving trans people for demographic reasons. So I started building in that space. And around that time, the World Economic Forum had like scouts called the Global Shapers. And they reached out to me and asked if I would join their like talent pipeline. So I got picked up by this massive entity that has just amplified my network. And then the Open Society Institute, I became a fellow there. And I started pushing this thesis of we can just build better tools for the social workers, and that'll solve all the social ills downstream of these tools and their designs. I still stand by that approach, but what I didn't understand was those contracts are very hard to acquire and they're very long. So getting through the government procurements and then getting these 10 and 12-year contracts to then be the software provider for every homeless services or housing assistance program in a region, it's amazing when you get it, but getting it takes forever. And we were mildly successful. We got a contract with the state of Maryland, and then the pandemic happened. So just to give you a quick run through the rest of it, I shifted from homeless services to consumer wearable devices for well-being. And then I did a little bit of design work, consultancy for startups and whatnot in that space, learned a lot. And then I moved into private equity, psychedelic therapeutic investing, realized the market wasn't quite mature enough for that, and took a lot of time away from work, sold my house, sold my 2 companies, and went into ultimately building a larger thesis around impact investing or influential investing. And that carried me for a while, but I didn't really access success. So I, in this past year, stepped away from a fund of funds where I was onboarding as a general partner, which is a term that basically means the founder level, at the highest level you can be in a fund. And I've been out on my own, doing strategic consultancy under a think tank that I built called Emergent Intelligence. So, and that looks like strategic consulting, so introductions, fund readiness, and the back end assets, data, financials, and marketing collateral to represent what it is this company's doing, and then how it should be valued. But also the inner work with the founders around mindset, right? To be able to vision an impactful vision, and then be the person required to execute and steward that vision and enroll the team and all their diverse specialties and working well. So when I talk about coaching, it's really part of the investment diligence process and fund readiness process. It's making sure that the leader is enrolling and rooted in their why, such that when they suddenly have resources and high-level institutional partners, they don't crumble or shift into some imposter dynamics or lose their conviction, right? So just ensuring we can share lessons learned. So that's what I do now, and it's emergent intelligence. And I think there's a lot of synergy from that really quick history I just gave with what's happening at True North and the potential, the future with SoulQuest. And yeah, and I'm sure we're going to get into this, but we crossed paths through the Flow Genome Project, where I'm as a consultancy, I'm helping with their enterprise engagements.
Great. Yeah, thanks for the backstory. It's kind of crazy how many different domains you just like breezed through, like through that hotel. And it's fascinating because like there's still many other aspects that we haven't touched on. And just with what we have, you've got a more diverse landscape of experience than most people that I know. So, and then on top of that, you've got I don't care, if you care to dive into it or not, but like a transformational journey through gender, and then also kind of a spiritual medicine path as well. And so there's like we've kind of gone through the kind of modern sort of entrepreneurial Jedi moves that you've done through your career, but there's these other 2 layers that I'm curious about also.
All right, love it. So the secret sauce of every entrepreneur is their connection, their understanding of all it is, and how to work with the field, right? How to work with emergence. So at the root of this, when I was traveling on one-way plane tickets out from going to Fordham University and studying economics and ethics, I was always there was a lot of world religions in that course, in that curriculum. So I was looking at theologies, and I had gone to a semester at the seminary in high school and things, and was always interested in this stuff. And it's very religious in my upbringing, Catholic, Italian-American family. So that group matured into the exploration of consciousness as a big psychonaut. And I wasn't, not necessarily psychedelics, but it was more, I found Tim Ferriss in 2010. I found Wim Hof in 2011 doing breath work to change state and things. And I'm sitting here in like an apartment in Seoul, Korea, doing a breath work session, changing my physiology and then accessing different clarity from my vibrational state. And that whole connection between these ecstatic states, and I didn't really have the language at the time, but the ecstatic states or these design states of consciousness and then innovation was always interesting to me. So I had also found hypnosis. And in hypnosis, this is like a little longer of a setup that's ultimately going to give you the frame for my gender and embodiment journey. But in hypnosis, I found a way to shift my state rapidly. Like it came first in meditation, then from meditation into guided meditation, then guided meditation into hypnosis, which is just guided meditation with inductions or on ramps and off ramps. And then there's some neurolinguistic programming that can happen inside of these sessions, which can be really useful. Andrew Huberman talks a lot about hypnosis these days in the app Revelry, which I recommend. So I started exploring that. In that frame, I had a lot of these non-ordinary experiences of gender where you were in hypnosis and then you would kind of become other people. And I think that this triggered in me this curiosity of what it would be like to be someone else. And I was like, wait, I could literally put on the mindset in hypnosis of like a different set of thoughts and frames. And then I would have an experience under hypnosis of this being someone else. And that was an escapism, right? And if I look back even earlier, there's a diagnosis or a field of research called automorphic disorder. And this is morphic autonomy refers to everything from a bodybuilder to cosmetic surgeries to transgender surgeries. Basically the ability to change your body. And I do believe in morphic freedom. So you do whatever you want with your body. You can grow a third arm out of your head. I don't care. Like celebrate life. But at the time, being in a conservative Italian-American family in this context of Maryland, the United States, I didn't really see the expressiveness that is available to men. So I repressed some of my more like interest in fashion or interest in dance. And I was out in the farm working. And I was out, working on the tractors and playing football and rugby, which I loved. But I wasn't ever really fully healthily expressing my more sensitive side. And these hypnotic experiences where I got to be, I'd sometimes be a woman, I'd sometimes be like you embody your feminine self and be in relation to your masculine self. And I'd go into these adventures in trance, and it was this expression of what had been repressed. And I really was activated on that. So, it wasn't a thing where I thought I was trans. I didn't know what trans meant. But I was hooked on the changing consciousness. I was hooked on the exploration of being someone else. And then, I was in a stable relationship, but my girlfriend, when I was living in Japan, went away for a month. And during that month, I got lonely. So I found a type of hypnosis, which was called erotic hypnosis. So essentially audio porn. And that, coupled with this transformational experience, I was in these trance experiences where I was I was me, then I was having sex with myself, and I was both the male and the female in the sex, and like rotating the perspective, and it was this mind expanding experience. And I was like, wait, there's a whole other part of me that I haven't touched. I now understand that my inner feminine wasn't integrated; it had been repressed. But at the time, I thought that this must mean I have this repressed whole side of me, and I need to start letting it out. So I started talking to a gender therapist, and they said, "Yep, you have a feminine superpower that's been repressed. You got to start letting that out and see what happens." I never said I want to be a woman. It was more, let's start being more Johnny Depp style. Well, it's like cut my beard every day, keep it clean shaven, let's wear tighter pants. And that was it for like 3-6 months. And I started working in the LGBT community around homelessness and whatnot. But then being in that community and externally referencing my values, I started sourcing belonging from that community. And before I knew it, I started really identifying in that community and taking on I was a victim of my upbringing. And if only I transform and do this morphic freedom with hormones and whatnot, then I could be unleashed on the world. Let me just do the hard thing and make this real. Right? So I did that, and it was scary. And I looked at the fear as this is the next challenge to overcome. So I went and started slowly stepping beyond gender, expanding gender. And it wasn't until in some social experiences in the activist communities, I'd be out and about, and I wasn't being read as like straight dude. I was being read as queer person, or I was being read as non-binary person. And then after some time, I was being read as a woman. And that was a weird experience. It didn't feel wrong. It felt like new terrain. So I went into that. And I actually explored cross-dressing a few times, and it was once I achieved a stealth where I would just be like a woman in space, I got this external perspective onto masculinity. I got to see how groups of men operate. And then I got to come back, take off those clothes, go back on a Monday to the cafe and working, but I can be better as a man. Now I'm kind of experiencing from the outside what it's like to look at groups of men, and I started working on that a little bit. And to say I was confused on my gender is an understatement, but I was definitely trying to construct from this perspective of the patriarchy is the root of all evil and capitalism is bad. I was trying to construct what would be good human, what would be a good form of human. And I went really deep in that ideology and that inquiry. Yeah. I can fast forward a bit to when I started deprogramming that and what the drive.
Yeah, I have a couple things I want to linger on. So
Yeah.
thank you for sharing that. It's
Yeah.
crazy and wild and fascinating from a psychology perspective. So I've been, we just mentioned SoulQuest a minute ago, which we'll dive into later, but because of SoulQuest, I've been down a Jungian psychological rabbit hole doing a bunch of research on exactly this, which is the integration of the shadow or the unconscious. And there's this interesting, well, there's a quote by, I think it's Hermann Hesse, which is, what is it? It's like, we must beware of your shadow or beware the shadow, like be aware of your shadow or beware the shadow, right?
Mm-hmm.
So basically become aware of your unconscious and the repressed aspects, or beware of those repressed aspects because they will, take the driver's seat at some point. And you see this a lot, in various ways with homophobia. And, a really fucked up example would be like, altar boys getting molested by priests, where you've got, the guy who's the antithesis supposedly of pedophilia and like the righteous father of the church who's actually doing the heinous acts behind the scenes with the little kids because of the shadow element that's not being integrated, right? And it being seen as so other and so evil and being pushed down into the closet, into the shadows. So it's interesting. And he also has Jung has this other concept called the anima and animus, which is the idea of basically just the fundamental nature of reality being a polarity and there always being a spectrum of polarity in every aspect. And so it's no different with gender. And so, you've got the, men masculine side of the polarity, but they have a feminine expression of that same spectrum of gender, and it would show up as the anima. And for women, it's the opposite, where they're expressing feminine primarily, but their shadow or their unconscious component's the animus, which is the masculine component. So basically, we all have both, and Jung would say that like, to actually reconcile those two parts and to bring all of the shadow elements into integration and into wholeness is essential for your process of what he called individuation, which is the full expression of yourself, the self coming into wholeness and actually being able to, I guess, bring forth its full creative potential.
Oh, I love the frame that you're sharing here, and I had encountered a bit of it during that time, but I will not say that I really internalized the original spirit of it. I actually encountered the animus as essentially permission to explore the feminine. I was like, oh, I'm exploring my animus, but I didn't quite get the note about integrating it, and I didn't quite get I took it very literally. So I took it as the most literal interpretation possible. And that was the hardest thing as well. And your 20s, you got to do that. And I was also in the frame of making everybody wrong. So the world was wrong, I was oppressed, and I would just demonstrate the other way, and soon the rapture would happen and everybody would come to my side. Right. So we now know the limitations of these viewpoints. And I think I hope that that's helpful for folks who maybe are exploring that or thinking about gender expansion or altering their morphic state, right? Changing their body in some way, if it's through cosmetic or through hormones or steroids or anything. There's these are in all of us, and there's an inner feminine in me right now, and that feminine expresses through maybe keeping my hair arranged and curated well, and maybe adorning my male body with fashion that's tailored and fits, right? And it doesn't mean that I need to go and cosmetically alter my body to express the feminine to integrate my anima.
Yeah.
I wish I could have told my 24-year-old self that.
Yeah, no shit. Yeah. And so for anyone listening, like
Yeah.
this is I would definitely heed this experience in wisdom, because you're talking, we're listening to somebody who's literally gone through the crucible of that physical journey of going through the operations and the actual transitions, and then back, like doing the full circle loop from masculine to feminine to back to masculine. And that being kind of really in lots of ways a kind of a traumatic alternative to the integration.
Yeah.
So it's definitely, it's super grateful that you're sharing your story. And I would just like to say, beyond just like the superficial level, because, it's easy for people to say, oh yeah, well, I'm not, trying to put on women's clothes, so this doesn't apply to me or something. Well, it's like, no, your feminine aspect could just be the nurturing aspect. It could just be the support versus the challenge, right? So if masculine energy is pushing you to be better and to attain higher, reach higher, then the feminine is more of just like holding down the fort, and supporting you and nurturing. And so it's not just about, what clothes we want to wear, if we're into dance or whatever it is. There's a deep essence component to this that is unavoidable just because of the nature fundamentally of reality, of it being a polarity. And so I think, go ahead.
Yeah, well, 100%. And how it expresses in most men is in male fragility or masculine fragility. So any male that I see, you may know men like this who their greatest fear is that someone might think they're feminine or think they're gay or something. And that is, as far as, being fully expressed and integrated as a human, if you're holding such a possibility as such a negative impact on your existence, like you're definitely not expressing anything in the territory of feminine or in the territory of intimacy with other men, because for fear of it being misread. And that is so much in relationship that it cannot express if that fear is blocking it. So giving a brother a hug and using the word brother to code that relationship as platonic and sibling intimacy that's how bonds are built, right? And I had resistance, and I see a lot of men who have resistance to being vulnerable, masks off with other men because they don't want to be read as gay, they don't want to be read as feminine. And so the opportunity for all of us to broaden the conversation's relatability would be to say, like, this may be in you as fear of judgment in some way that then informs your repressing. So yeah, and it might be useful to just drop in here that I worked with ceremonial plant medicines, first with the Wiharika, and those peyote ceremonies where they would travel from Mexico up to the East Coast and had some transformational experiences there, and was still living as a transsexual or transgender woman, which I think is more accurately described as like a fancy eunuch, right? I was essentially had a castrating surgery and then had cosmetic surgeries to have the cosmetic appearance and social functioning, and rightly, the social function of a woman in society while not being fertile. We can pick apart we can rabbit hole down on a lot of that stuff with like ethics and integrity and kind of confusion in the dating dynamics of transsexuals and straight people. But that's a whole nother wormhole. But I was in that, and I had these ceremonies, and I got that something needed to change, but I didn't have my finger. I didn't yet understand that this whole transgender experience was out of alignment. I still thought I was doing the noble and right thing of expanding gender in the world and therefore mitigating the harm the patriarchy had created in the world.
Can I quickly double
Please.
tap on
Yeah.
that, because
Yeah.
I have that written down here, something I wanted to hover on as well. You mentioned earlier about this scene, the LGBTQ scene, providing belonging and a sense of validation, camaraderie, probably purpose as well. I mean, the social justice component, right? Like, yeah, like giving you a thing to strive for, or a thing to fight against, right? Like in this case, patriarchy or some sort of oppressive tyranny that's preventing or holding back um, positive expressions of who people really are, right? Which there's obviously nuance and there's signal on both sides of this. So it's not to say, first of all, reject the binary, the binary good bad, and if you understand just the polarity of everything, uh, you have to start rejecting the good bad binary all over the place, right? And so, like, if gender is more of this sort of fluid spectrum between masculine and feminine, and we're all kind of holding both elements in different sort of doses, or however you want to say that. And at the same time, like the light spectrum is a gradient from light to dark. And it's like, well, what point does it just not be light anymore? It's like all gradients of light, right? And temperature, it's all different degrees of temperature. So we're talking about variations of degree here, not necessarily yes, no binaries. And so when it comes to, say, like a tough, tricky polarity, like, say, justice versus like social justice or change, right? Like basically the vibe I'm getting is like this culture was primarily pushing revolution, is pushing some sort of progressive thinking, new way of things, fuck the status quo, right? Which I've got my own, orientation in the same sort of way. I consider myself a bit of a rebel, and I've been kind of a black sheep in my family, and that's sort of a different story. But basically, I resonate with it. But on the other hand, there's the polarity of the other side of that polarity, which is the traditional values, the reason that things are the way they are. There's usually some signal on that side as well. And so it's interesting that you kind of found your tribe in a way, but because of that, it kind of accelerated this, without that scaffolding and without that cultural pressure, potentially you wouldn't have had the incentives to rush into,
Exactly.
some augmentation surgery, right?
Exactly. I probably would have stabilized in some kind of Orlando Bloom aesthetic, legal Lord of the Rings or something, and I would have been
I
just
get
fine.
hot, dude. There's nothing wrong with Orlando Bloom.
I know. For sure. And then I probably would have found my way to Italy at some point and been like, oh, everybody here is exactly like me. And like men are talking about the material of their suits. Like in Naples, the tailors were clothing all the royalty throughout Europe. They were sensitive to that somatic experience of wearing a well-curated piece of clothing. And this is a Japanese shirt that I have right here. And I spend a lot on t-shirts. I actually have some north of $100 shirts nowadays that were made on looms in Japan, and I'm just all about it. Like, I know it's a waste of money, it's an overexpense, but I love it. And when I went to Italy, I found everyone was like that, and it was solidly in the masculine polarity in mate seeking and dating, but it was also this feminine aspect, and it just all made sense. And nothing against my family of origin. My father was amazing. So much gratitude to how he taught us first principles and how to steward the tractors and fix the equipment on the farm and do the hard work, and then also sent us to awesome schools and enabled us to achieve scholarships into university and whatnot. So I got a really solid background, and my family loved me throughout all of the roller coaster of it. That's not the case for many trans people, so I'm very grateful for that. But I didn't get our real Italian roots, and a whole host of reasons that they were shut down. Like Italians were considered very like unemployable in the 70s and 60s because we were like, dirty and whatnot. And people don't really know this, but like, the Italian armies, the battaglias and whatnot, were brought in from Sicily to help with the ports in the United States, help with the import-export, gray economies, and they did that very well. Organized crime was actually invited over to the United States, and that whole if you weren't in organized crime, which my family wasn't, then you were trying to kind of hide your Italianness to get employment. So they would change their names. What my grandfather wasn't, my great uncle was not Vito, he was Michael or something when he was working, or Brian or something like this. And you couldn't be Vince when you were working. You had to be Sean or something like a little more Anglo. And I think picked up the intergenerational strategy around that. I inherited that frame of repress my Italian, express, more Anglo or Western European dynamics, and that I think is at the root of it. And then there's a whole developmental psychology read on this, and neuroscience read on this, with the kind of reward payoff cascades around your body wants to hit puberty, wants to develop into a mature adult, and it wants to have reproductive function. So you have all these dopamine rewards and cascades around puberty and successful functioning development of a body. And if you start changing that or accelerating that with hormones or surgeries, you kind of get addicted to it. This is the automorphic addiction disorder frame, and your body has a massive reward release when you've successfully achieved a level of developmental maturity, even though you kind of hacked it. So I think that I more accurately got addicted to physical transformation than I was finding embodiment. And
Yeah.
and the trans community was saying, oh, you're more comfortable, or you're finding this. But after a year or two of being stably read as a woman, operating as a woman, updating all my documents, it was so boring. And then the root cause was not really addressed. The root cause that I set out on the quest to alleviate was still there, right?
Yeah.
Excitement.
Which is the lack of wholeness, right?
Yes. Yes.
Because now you're repressing the masculine side.
Yeah.
So it's like,
Yeah.
yes, it's
Performatively too, super performative. But
right.
I was able to do it. But if I look back at my TED talk from 2018 or whatever, I can't even, my voice is so performative. I mean, I was saying cool stuff, but I was going above and beyond what is natural to try and be read as a female, when what I really was and still essentially am is more of a castrated male, technically. And a lot of people will jar in hearing that, but that's a little more accurate of a description. And then I have a fancy surgery that has I'm sexually functional, but it's not. There's so much technology in our birth hardware, like that, like the sexual systems and the energy and the dynamics of the organ systems, and like relating to that's developed in tantra and explored. There's so much subtle nuance to real relational yoga that is now challenging to access with my surgically created genitals. Right? Expect a young trans questioning person to understand that in their calculus as to whether I have a surgery or not.
Right. Yeah. Well, we're so fucking disconnected from the body and our culture, and just like there's not I mean, obviously there's lack of integration on many levels, but it's, now you're talking about more of like an energetics and a spiritual component to being a human being, and just having this relationship between body, mind, spirit, or soul. And there being a real frontier there for many of us to go and explore. Like it's pretty much for me, this is what has been, my experience, is that it kind of spontaneously happened unexpectedly in a flow tank in 2018. And I sort of like all of a sudden booted up in a way that I'd never experienced before, thanks to some edibles and some Wim Hof breath work. Shout out to Wim for both of us.
Yeah.
But yeah, man, like it absolutely fundamentally shifted how I perceived just what the human being is as an organism, and what, the sort of realm of consciousness and being is. It just profoundly oriented me towards curiosity of just like, wow, I really don't know. I really don't know like what's going on here, and I need to like explore it. So yeah, it's like I would encourage anybody who's having, stress or duress or any sort of real struggles around, not just gender, but like your identity, right? Like your sense of self, and what you are, and like how you're supposed to express, into the world. Just know that that's a normal part of maturation and individuation, and that, rather than making dramatic choices like irreversible surgeries, you can instead get curious and go on a journey of self-discovery and exploration and integration of all of the different aspects and remove the lens of judgment. And that's hard to do because the culture is putting so goddamn much judgment on it for you. But it's really about dissolving that cultural conditioning so that you can, I guess, have some self-love and a different kind of relationship with yourself.
Well said. And when I talk about this, I've got these guitars behind me. If the body is an instrument, learn to play a song before you start modifying the instrument.
Mm.
Learn to play a song. Learn what the thing can do as it is, as it's been used and played for thousands of years of our species history before starting to augment it. And yet, it was until 2017 that the World Economic Forum had a council on human enhancement. Now it's a bit of an underground council, but they still kind of meet. And this was like longevity, this was genetic therapies, and this is a hair's breadth away from eugenics.
Mm-hmm.
So this
just to give people what do you mean by eugenics? Just so people know.
Yeah, eugenics is the altering of human life forms, right? So it's auditing the evolutionary processes of our species for a specific purpose, and it was used. It can be accomplished through everything from genetic therapies to pharmaceuticals to genocide to population control, reproductive regulations. These all can have a directional effect on how our species iterates into its final forms. Yeah.
It has lots of sinister applications, including, like Nazi Germany is kind of, the Holocaust was a form of eugenics, which is basically trying to change the nature of the gene pool, right?
Selecting up the podcast if it's all on YouTube, but yeah.
It's really quite scary. In other words, and when you get into CRISPR and gene therapy, and the idea of playing God and taking the sort of chance out of it and starting to selectively create and sort of augment and breed humans that are, I guess, based on your narrow lens, the right kind, or the ones that are optimal or better, right? So it's kind of an interesting one.
Yeah, and this is a conversation we've had before. It might be interesting to walk into together here, because I think it does take the conversation from my personal experience, but I can give you the detransition catalysts and thereafter, and then what that looks like professionally for me now with this think tank that's talking about emergent intelligence, which is that groups in coherence having broader insights than any one of their parts, or the aggregate of their parts even. And this is like, we are an evolving species, and we make tools, our tools make us. And the fastest feedback loops are our linguistic tools, because language is technology. So we make language and language shapes us. And identity politics, transgender ideology is a linguistic tool that is getting really fast iterative feedback loops that's kind of spiraling into these branches of society, which may or may not be able to integrate back into the whole project of our species. So I think that's the kicker is, can this, whatever project, whatever it is, if it's life extension, if it's increasing health span over lifespan, does that actually loop back into serving the whole, or is this more of a divergent brand for a specialized group? And then how as a society we make sense of that, right? So you may know a trans person. Are they advocating for the whole world to become trans? Are they just advocating for acceptance and to blend in? Are they advocating for this automorphic freedom where we can all get cybernetic enhancements one day? And I think within the trans community, they're super divided on all of that, right? But it is a great innovation community to get some feedback on what works and what doesn't, as far as altering our human body and for an end. So it's not too dissimilar from the conversation surrounding Neuralink. It's not dissimilar from the conversation surrounding nootropics and biohacking, right? So that we could open that up a little bit, or I can kind of keep going back into the detrans story and some of the personal development distinctions that clarity for me. Yeah.
Just so we can kind of come full circle and kind of put a period at the end of the sentence with um the trans story,
Yeah.
and how you kind of, yeah, like segue from like kind of the height of that, the height of your womanhood, and get us back to where you're at now, which is obviously, anytime you go on a heroic journey like that, you're bringing something back with you, and so now you've got unique perspective that very few people have, and yeah, that can be very valuable in lots of ways.
For sure. Yeah, the gold is in the communication. How much our bodies and our sensing of context is involved in communication, word choice, syntax, rhythm, and there's a lot there. So that's where I'm going to go. But so I, went into women's tantra spaces, women's retreats, women's healing centers, women's personal development containers, and I was blending. I was not very observable as the trans person in the room. So what an experience to be able to access now that I'm doing
Mm.
men's work, right? What an experience to be able to reference. I did I learned a lot about authentic relating. I learned a lot about nonviolent communication. And I learned that women, there's a communication because subcutaneous fat is different, primarily, at least in my experience. Subcutaneous fat is different. That means there's more like fat and more sensitivity in the skin. I was more aware of like environment, temperature, wind, vocal tone, things that were a little bit more sensitive. And the communication between other women was kind of about that. Whereas when I'm talking to men, we have an idea and we're scaffolding our argumentation to communicate that idea and analyze the merit of it. It's kind of directional and externally focused. Whereas female systems are like kind of sharing their experience and kind of getting the space between the words and then syncing up. So we'll
Yeah.
be talking about something that we've never mentioned. And then at the end of 10 minutes of talking, it's like we've outlined it. And that's the conversation
Yeah.
is outlined instead of pointed out.
It's fucking hilarious. You're going so meta on my mind right now because, like, as you're saying that, I wanted to scaffold something even more because you're talking about the difference in flow and the feeling of being a woman. And I just wanted to add a little scaffolding and say, so basically, part of this process of this transition is to start receiving, exogenous hormones that are, to kind of orient your psychology and biology to be more like a woman. And then the reverse of that would be exogenous, masculine hormones, testosterone, namely, right?
Yeah.
So it's interesting because biology is upstream from psychology. And so, like, by changing the biology, by taking in these exogenous hormones, you're then going to, both change biologically because it's all, chemicals. And you're just like downstream from those chemicals is different subcutaneous fat and whatever. And then you're also going to have a psychological expression of that. So I just wanted to add that layer of scaffolding for people who are unaware of what actually happens in this process.
I love it. And postural changes and the social dynamics. So where you stand in the social contract and how you communicate based on that. I remember there was a distinct point where, let's say you're walking home from a restaurant or a bar at night, and as a man, they come up, they ask for your wallet, or you don't give it to them, it's a fight, you give it to them, they go away. But as a female, when they're reading you as a woman, you give your wallet and that's not what they want.
Mm.
Right. So there's a different status in public space. And that expresses even more subtly, like you're in the cafe checking out for your coffee at Starbucks, right? And they're asking you for your name, but it's a hair's breadth away from them asking for your number because what they really want is to get intimate with you, and you can feel that, right? And then being just sitting there working on your computer, you can feel the observation and the attention of others. And maybe I liked that at some point. Now I understand a lot of women entrepreneurs will use kind of that vitality and quote unquote sex appeal to attract attention to their project, and then the investor kind of will stumble when they realize that, like, oh no, they're caught up in that. So there's a lot of coaching I think is valuable for female entrepreneurs on how to wield that well and not attract people for personal dynamics and then try and judo flip that into a professional synergy. Like just being objective, which is calm, cool, and unemotional, which is the arena of business, that the metrics speak for themselves, the product's value speaks for itself. Try it, let me know. That's a very different thing than the female communication paradigm centers around. So I have a lot of insight around that, but I think that in my lived experience, I had to learn how to curate my energy in a space as a woman. And then when I detransitioned, the merit of my ideas didn't really change too much. Just with time, I refined some things. But suddenly I was getting a different set of attention, a different level of listening, and therefore a different level of outcomes in the relationships.
So just
Right?
to be clear, you're saying that by expressing publicly expressing more masculine energy and coming across that way to people, you got better reception from people on the domain of ideas.
Yeah. And I had to, even as a woman, I had to do that. I had to kind of play with what I was wearing, play with my posture to not to shift the energy. Marilyn Monroe is famous for having said that she could walk in a room and be Marilyn Monroe, or she could walk in a room and kind of be invisible and then suddenly turn it on, right? Or turn it off. And that's a real thing. That's a real thing. And I don't believe it's taught, right? It's not taught to young women. And yes, wear what you want, celebrate your ability to freely express, but also there is integrity and responsibility of our impact in a space. And this goes all the way into language too. But I think now as a man, like I know if I could go to an investor demo day or a fundraising event and have long hair and have like a, indigenous shirt on and ayahuasca beads on my wrist, I'm going to get a different level of relationship, and I'm going to be flagging different things, and the outcomes will be different than if I wear a button down, have short hair, clean, tight. And then also, by the way, I can go there in the esoteric conversation. I can go into a spiritual conversation, but my starting point based on my visual presentation and curation is going to be more in line with why I'm there. So there's something around aligning every aspect of self being an expression integrated towards what you're actually here to do. Right.
Yes. Well
Right.
said. Yeah, I
Yeah.
love that. Love that. Yeah, this is like great foreshadowing to where I want to ultimately go with this conversation. But more scaffolding. My my masculine mind is like trying to like set the stage for it. So I want to talk a little bit about my story just because I think it sets up well a question I want to ask you, and then also gives a frame for kind of the next leg of the combo. But so I didn't go through like leave the or go through this sort of like what's the right metaphor for this, because it's almost like a red pill in a sense, like you're popping out of a world, right? And so like with your transition journey, you're in a way leaving one world and going into
I
another.
went to a zeitgeist. I rode this wave of a zeitgeist. Then I kind of fell off the wave or wiped out a little bit, and then had to paddle into a new wave and or generate my own momentum.
Yeah, that's a good way to say it. So but like so for me, the wave I fell off of was the sort of the more patriarchal wave. It was the fundamentalist Mormon wave. So I grew up in that until and didn't fall off the wave until I was 20. So basically that zeitgeist, which was kind of a microcosm of one town within a bigger macrocosm of say Utah, but and then a bigger macrocosm of say just a Christian nation that's pretty male dominated in some ways, right? That was sort of the world I grew up in. And it's interesting because, I mean, I'm child 18 out of 24 in a large family, right? Growing up in a small town where everybody believes the same, and fundamentally, not like everyone has the same opinion about everything, but that the nature of reality, in other words, this kind of creationist story that God is a man, a physical person that is kind of a divine being who kind of shapes the planet or builds the universe, shapes the world out of, kind of like how a potter shapes clay. So it's the universe as an artifact, or the ceramic model of the universe is what Alan Watts called it. Basically, God is this sort of architect, structure builder type person. This is why like Jesus's dad is a carpenter, right? In the story of Jesus. So basically, the father of the universe shapes the planet in this creationist story. The world's built in 6 days, etc. That story is not questioned. You know what I mean? And in where I grew up. So it was like growing up inside of that container, which is from the very beginning, from the first story, it's patriarchal, right? Like there's a father of the universe, but no one tells you about the mother of the universe. No one talks about Gaia or the goddess. Like there's no conversation around Sophia, right? Like there's not like a other side of the polarity, right? That's missing, which is surprising because, each man's supposed to have multiple wives. And so like you'd think that just because of the lopsidedness of that equation, that there'd be emphasis on the feminine, but there's actually not. And in fact, the feminine are encouraged to be submissive and to be uh, subservient to their husbands in lots of ways. So I grew up in that context, and it wasn't until I was 20 that I had an encounter with the internet, which pretty much broke my faith on the spot. Is a document called the CES letter, which was written by a man named Jeremy Runnels, which is just a short document compiling the problematic uh, problematic problems, the issues with Mormonism in general, in the sense of just like falsifiable evidence, and found that, and it just kind of cracked me open. And I've since had Jeremy on the podcast, and I've talked about the CS letter in other episodes, but basically that was my first pop out of, or falling off the wave, and kind of like shift in perspective in a major way. And then I kind of spent the next 5 years sort of just kind of flailing in the whitewater, right? Like trying to figure out, well, what do I stand on? The rug just got ripped out from under me. Where are the other stories of value that I can kind of glom onto? And, instead I found, instead of a Sabbath practice, I found football on Sunday, and alcohol and consumerism and materialism and sort of this American dream of just like chase the dollar and you'll be happy. So I did that for 5 years and was pretty good at chasing the dollars, but pretty empty on the inside, right? So eventually, by some sort of stroke of luck or grace, and shout out to Joe Rogan for talking about float tanks, like getting me in the float tank, getting me doing Wim Hof, and getting me on an edible. Like all three of those things are because of this podcast. Had a pretty profound, spontaneous, there's buzzwords you can throw around like Kundalini awakening or whatever, but basically I just had I switched on. Like I felt like I booted up and got out of that tank seeing reality with fresh eyes, and seeing the universe is full of possibility, and the creator of it and of my reality, and like I can do anything next. Like there's nothing stopping me from whatever I want to do. And so yeah, that was just the next layer out. That was like the second version of, say, the CES letter. It was like it was popping out of that other bubble. And so since then I've been kind of like doing this thing, traveling around the world, so a lot of travel, a lot of I guess travel in the way of exploration of philosophy, travel in the way of exploration of ideas, and things like this podcast and exploring and talking to other people, but basically just trying to like click out and get a wider lens of the world. And that led me to ultimately open up my business to try to like help others find a rabbit hole that can kind of be their way out of the quote unquote matrix, right? Portal. And yeah, portal, exactly. Trying to open up portals, and ended up down at Arcadia, where I met. Yeah, you got Arcadia poster on the wall behind you. You were here this year, but I was there last year, and that's where I met Jamie and listened to him speak. I'd already read Jamie Will's books, Recapture the Rapture, Stilling Fire, and he was one of the primary reasons I wanted to go to the festival, because he was one of the headline speakers. And that opened up a whole nother door into both sense making and kind of cultural architecture. And ultimately that's how we met, was at an event he was putting on in an Aspen called Camp Omega back in the summer. And I think you've been also working with Jamie on his team. So yeah, that kind of gets us up to speed. But before we segue into the FGP convo, or cultural architecture, so I've got this kind of patriarchal story background. And my question to you is, with your experience and having been on the inside of the female experience, right? And then, had both sides of that equation, what do you think is the relationship in our culture between masculine and feminine and say the patriarchy? And, is it all oppression? Or like, guys like Jordan Peterson like to try to defend, patriarchy or at least masculinity, right? And so my question is like, yeah, what's your perspective or your sense of the actual dynamic between men and women?
I love this. And this is, we can wander into the manosphere of thought with Peterson and Patrick Bet-David, et cetera. Interesting, and there's value there. Like they're talking young men off the edge, they're giving men purpose through discipline and action, which is critical. And I do acknowledge, like, you've driven on a road lately, it's probably built by a man, right?
Yeah.
And the stat is something like 99.9994% of military casualties are male. So it's essentially the dirty jobs. And then the other stat is 4% of men control the wealth. The remaining 96% are like middle to working class. So this is kind of an illusion that comes out of feminism, which is wounded feminine, that men control the world and whatnot. There are some, but there are also a proportion of elite and aristocracy who are female inheritors of legacy. So I would problematize this frame that, like, the patriarchs control the world. But I think that in design concepts, we have an overwhelming alignment of value in the market with masculine structures. And I don't align with the artificially positioning or elevating females in masculine organizational structures. I think affirmative action hurts everybody. I know that because when I was trans, I was put on a lot of boards and higher positions, and then I could only talk about trans stuff. Didn't actually earn my way there, so I couldn't talk about the content of that task force or that board. I was just there to be a token, and I felt that I was surrounded by that in much the same way like a person of color, a Black person, is surrounded by the conversation of race when their affirmative action elevated into a position in an organization or a school, and then their merit is not centered, and then their whole identity and rewards and motivations shift to conform to the thing that got them access, so they can get more access, and then it really like diverts their potential into this identity-based expression where they could have been the next architect, they could have been the next technologist, and now they're suddenly just a proponent of some kind of artificial affirmative action. And
AKA they're just their race or they're just their gender.
You've been reduced from being human to being a demographic. And so I think what we actually would do well to look at is feminine organizational structures. This is cooperatives, this is collectives, this is type of franchises, maybe with participatory governance. There are new financial instruments that can provide non-extractive debt. There are all sorts of ways to honor diversity and cultivate diversity organizationally, which aren't optimized for efficiency and scale. They're optimized for capturing genius and delivering value in diversity, right? We know if you homogenize everything, like monocropped corn, one virus comes in and kills the whole farm, right? We know life and vitality is correlated to diversity. Ideological diversity, cultural diversity, ethnic diversity makes robustness and therefore resilience.
Species diversity primarily,
sure.
right? Corn
Yeah.
isn't be more vulnerable to disease, but you're going to have to actually kill off everything else that's trying to live there for the corn to grow. And then you got to like artificially prop it up with all these fertilizers and pesticides.
Hence our ideological hegemonies that eventually mature into a fascism, right? That's the fertilizer and pesticides that are all optimized for that specific expression of ideology, as opposed to being in the crucible of the market.
Wow.
Dialogue.
What a great metaphor. It's like you have to continuously spray the fucking thing with some crop duster, and the crop duster is the ideology, and it's keeping everything the same. It's keeping that status quo kind of held together when everything is trying to break free into more diversity.
For sure. Critically into more diversity in the evolutionary payoff system, that reproduction. Life wants to keep living right through the human experience. Doesn't want to get specialized into one kind of hegemonic expression. So this is same, right? Turtles all the way down, as within, so without. So I think that one of the things I'm getting from Flow Genome really is being able to communicate and relate across ideological diversity. And instead of making the other person wrong, like, we're going to sharpen our swords together. We're going to improve our tools together. We're going to communicate better. And the reward for that in the infinite game is just exponential. And I will also say, like, some of the manosphere folks are advocating for civility. In being less agreeable, you can have communication across paradigms, and they're not trying to say, like, I'm right, you're wrong. They're trying to say, this is what I'm hearing. Is that what you meant? Oh, this is what I meant. Thank you. This is what, right? Civility, right? That is a lost value. And we can go deep on this, but I really am beginning to center that word more. Like, civility is key to civilization, and if we're not civil with one another, then we get the kind of friction points, we get the negative discourse, and we get the judgments, and we get the shame, right? So
Yeah.
I respect. We all signed up for a dojo in this life, and I want nothing more than everyone I meet to be thriving in their dojo. I don't know where they are in it. As long as they're in it and they're applying themselves, like, I got you. Let's be in relationship.
Yeah, I love that. To me, it sort of brings up the notion of dialogos, which is kind of, for me, like it's like the supreme dialogue. It's like civility at its core, which is instead of an expression of civility, which is like, okay, I'll tolerate you, or I'll handle, your you-ness to a certain degree. Dialogos is more like, I actually am deeply curious about you because there's something that wants to emerge that's only possible if both of us are exploring it together in good faith, right? And
Exactly.
we can arrive someplace that neither one of us expected, and a third sort of, like, thing besides my truth and your truth emerges, like this greater truth.
Yes, yes. And that's so critical for orienting society. And we were talking earlier about the evolution of our society materially and biologically. And, like, that is a participatory process. And I think morphic freedom is critical in that. People need to be able to manifest their biology as they prefer. And we could talk about tolerance and consent versus condoning and these kinds of distinctions, because I think they matter, right? Like, and it also cools it, like, temperature wise, it cools the tension for people that are feeling a need to go in the streets and parade their uniqueness. Get your celebration, go throw the dance party. I'm all about it. I support you, but I don't feel called to go and march to celebrate the expansion or the release from repression as much as I did in the past. And I'm speaking in the LGBT community, but there's also other identities. I think that I'm in Koreatown in Los Angeles right now, and so many cultural festivals that happen. They close the block down, the block party, and it's the Guatemala festival now, it's the Colombian festival now, and it's great. That's it. That's like, celebrate the cultural diversity. But I don't see anybody. I haven't yet been around for the quote unquote pride, and I so support it. Like, get your love. But I think that there was an energy in the beginning of that where, if you look at the history, Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera were at this club where the law said you can only wear 3 articles. You had to wear 3 articles of your birth, gender, birth, sex's clothing, and the police came to bust this club up because they knew people would not satisfy that law. So this was the Stonewall Inn. And the instead of fighting the police, they, like, started dancing in front of the police, and the police ultimately, like, started throwing rocks at them. And they like, eventually they arrested a bunch of them. But the next day they, like, had a parade, but it was quasi-militant. They were, like, basically anti-police rhetoric and parading in the streets saying, like, we're here and we're queer. I feel in my body right now there's some energy, like, that's exciting. It's like, you can't repress me. I'm alive. But
Yeah.
at a certain point, that's so attractive to young people who are seeking that I think it has an unintended effect,
Yeah. They get kind of sucked into the gravity of it, and it might pull you further. The
Yeah,
pendulum might swing further than you actually intended.
yeah,
And then, you're like, augmenting your body and doing all the things that really, also, we haven't talked about this, but, like, we mentioned, biology is upstream from psychology, which is just to say that your psychology is an emergent phenomena from your body, from your biology. It's not like there's this like Cartesian perspective that mind body are separate. They're actually very interrelated. And so, if just do the math, like, if your hand goes into a fire, your mental and psychological state changes rapidly into one of pain and suffering. So, like, to be in an environment where there are just an unbelievable quantity of pollutants and chemicals and hormones and all types of things, plastics that are coming into your biome in various ways through the water supply, through the food that's wrapped in it, through the all the different mechanisms, the microplastics and everything else. And to act like that's not having an effect on your psychology when it's clearly having an effect on biology. Biology is totally different now. I mean, sperm counts are way down, testosterone levels are way down. The I would say that part of this, if not a good majority, probably most of this whole wave of I don't know, non-binary wave or whatever you want to call it.
Informed to medical, cultural, medical informed.
Yeah, it seems like it's got to be environmental. I think environmental is probably the biggest factor
Yeah,
because
there's some
of
interesting work in this. There's some interesting work on this. A friend of mine, PhD researcher at Hopkins, was researching like membrane permeability for dioxin emissions around the trash incinerators in inner cities, especially in Baltimore, and the like disproportionate representation of LGBTQ identities, and then therefore HIV. And it was she secured serious HIV funding to do this research because they were like, wait a minute, you're burning trash and this horrible microplastics and toxins, dioxins in the air from this trash incinerator. And then around it, everybody's got HIV. And there's a lot of homosexual community around it. And we can say that socioeconomic reasons is cheaper real estate and LGBT identities have a harder time finding employment, typically have lower socioeconomic access. You can say that, and that's also complex influence in that, our forcing function. But I think ultimately this medical layer is significant. And her research confirmed that it was very significant that HIV transmission through these more permeable membranes in the anal tissue and the oral tissue were a huge factor in the transmission of this virus.
Mm.
And we're making it more transmissible. Even straight people were contracting HIV through traditional reproductive sexual behaviors because their membranes were even more susceptible, and they didn't even know they were carrying and transmitting. So they're 100% yes.
Have you heard or read the book Countdown by Shauna Swan?
No, actually, I was thinking Drawdown, which is another one, but yeah.
So this one is she's a researcher who's done this really long like very, very long deep dive into this story around microplastics and just plastics in the environment in general, and the correlation between plastics and fertility. So basically what seems to be the case, according to her work, is that as since like the 50s when we started like mass producing plastics, so if you look at these two charts where one is like this uptick, this upward curve of plastics in the environment, the other is a downward curve of sperm counts and testosterone levels, and they're exactly correlated across the years. So it's like how do you make that shit up? It's like as you're and what they found is that some of these compounds in plastics called phthalates, if they make it into your biology, they repress the production of testosterone. And if this happens to a pregnant woman while she's gestating in the early days of her pregnancy, and you've got a zygote trying to develop, and in those first like 14 days, it's critical that, if it's going to be a man, that testosterone is produced. And if she's got these phthalates in her biome at that critical stage, then the testosterone's underproduced, and then the baby is undermasculinated. And so it doesn't fully develop full masculinity. And this is measurable through, taint size and dick size and stuff. So it's crazy that we are experiencing a whole generation of humans that are a different kind of masculinity, and it's environmental 100%.
100%, and it is environmental. I think that the again, mimetic evolution, the feedback loop, this is a longer feedback loop, but it's just the same. We talked about language earlier. This is environmental, and this is maybe consumption technologies impacting our reproductive development, and it's again technology impacting our biology and this feedback loop. And then to make it personal for me, when I was in Japan was when I had this hypnotically informed. I accepted the idea that maybe I was a woman or I had some female traits, and through hypnotic experiences, and then the zeitgeist and the culture. But also, Japan is the most trash incinerators ever. All their trash is on island and they don't ship it out. So they burn it all. And everything is wrapped in plastic. And everything is wrapped in preservatives and things, unless you go to the high-end restaurants where it's actually really, really organic and sustainably sourced. So I often think about that and how much soy I was consuming, how much phytoestrogens I was consuming. My endocrine system was in probably a very low testosterone state during that time. And actually, Andrew Huberman just spoke about this. Tim Ferriss ran a podcast with Huberman today, that they recorded like a year or two ago, and Huberman talks about this exact thread of the endocrine system and prenatal development and gender, because apparently, I didn't know this until today, apparently his PhD advisor was a transgender man and was a psychologist, psychiatric researcher, which is what Huberman is. He's not a clinician, he's a researcher. So he's a psychiatric researcher. So and the way he talked then about the transgender experience is mirroring what we're touching on now. And then he pointed towards his PhD professor's research to go further. And the guy's name is Barry. So you can like Huberman, Barry, PhD, trans, and it'll come up. But he cited a indigenous population that has this sensitivity genetically, where they're androgen insensitive. So these males are born having developed vaginas in utero and are born with vaginas. And it's not until their primary puberty, or they're 12 years old, where the DHT levels and testosterone levels, all the androgen hormone levels, are in the right ratio to then facilitate primary sex characteristic development of males. Even though they're males biologically and genetically, they come out as females and then develop the penile shaft. It like emerges from the vagina at age 11, right? So there are examples of this. And when I was in the trans community more actively, I spoke about the anthropology of gender-expansive roles throughout the planet, and they're in place-based indigenous cultures with a place-based spiritual container and protocols for ecstasis, and diet and ritual all around certain herbs and frameworks of medicine. And there were always honorable social roles for gender-expansive people. Like a doula in India was called a hijra. They're born male and they lived as females, and they had all these Ayurvedic herbs to feminize themselves. And they were honored as the doulas at birth and the doulas at death, right? They were also targeted by the British as like a cultural node to devalue, to then install the British education system. We can talk about colonial theory and these bodies as well. But then in Indonesia, the Bisu were these arbiters. They were judges and lawyers, and they were non-binary type people. Zen monks could be in this category, where they remove gender and they meditate to remove sexual arousal. There are shamans in Ethiopia that ride horses until they self-castrate. And there are mahu mahu in Hawaii, which don't do anything medical, but they embody, they essentially are bi-gendered people. They're very comfortable in both. They can be male or female, and they just can do essentially a conscious form of drag in the arts to preserve these cultural dances. There are so many examples, right? But in the global biotechnology accelerated non-sacramental transgender community of 2023, what's the honorable social function of transness? I posit that there might be opportunity in this consciousness cultural architecture conversation for some kind of wayfinding role for trans people. And I'm holding that signal a little bit, right? Maybe my embodied experience has some intuitive insights and discernment around cultural architecture. At least I'm sharing what I experienced in hopes that there's value to the listening audience, right? But I don't know if this is really the consensus in the trans community, that they have broader cultural value to communicate. I often just see social justice and or fashion, which could be honorable, but
yeah. I think that the social justice component seems to be the main outward expression of as far as like a deeper purpose, beyond the superficial layer. But yeah, it's that's an interesting point about, the unique perspective of trans people and the role that they could play, and potentially in kind of maybe even healing or trying to end this culture war, gender war, like the the polarity, the strong sort of like rift, the wound and the divide between sexes. It seems like we've got to find a way across that, because ultimately, like for the survival of our species, like people aren't reproducing anymore, like, and a lot of that's environmental. Obviously, most of it's probably environmental, but a lot of it, like, if biology is upstream from psychology, then the environment's upstream of culture, right? In the
Yes.
sense that, like where you live and your relationship to the place, how much sunlight you're getting, if you're connected to the water, if the water's sacred, or if it's in a bottle that's just a product, or like, are you growing the food? Is the food wrapped in plastic on a shelf and you just pick it up, right? Like, are you in relationship to the other humans in your environment, or are they all just kind of siloed off in their own little boxes and in a stack, right? And like the way that you live in the environment that holds you emerges the culture, right? In large part. So yeah, I feel like right now our environment is really suffering, and it's manifesting too in these weird sort of cultural yeah, like, what's the right word? Like there's this strange sort of cultural distortions that are kind
Mhm.
of expressions of our little human individual biology just being kind of pinballed around in a world of pollutants and concrete jungles.
Yeah, 100%. And the concrete jungle isn't in principle different from the actual jungles in Amazon, the Congo, right? And I think we got to always remember, like, are we biomimicking? Are we using syntropic design principles, or are we dissonant? I want to maybe put a pin in the detransition, because how did I get out of the delusion, right?
Right,
Well,
right,
I actually had insight to stop injecting my hormones, and it was the most efficient way. I woke up one day in a house that I built. I had two companies. I had the wearable device company and I had the home services software company. And I built a house like from scratch, right? Bought it, gutted it, and remodeled the whole house, crystal gridded it. Amazing. Loved it. And I had a live-in partner. She was absolutely beautiful, spiritually integrated, amazing. Pandemic was just starting. And I woke up one day and I like, wow, I have, she's next to me. This is amazing. This is an amazing house. And I looked at my body and I'm like, wow, this is like, I felt like I was very beautiful and such a gift. But then I realized that like I wasn't actually there. Like this avatar, this mask that I built that was externally referenced on the culture wasn't what I wanted. It was all external. This house wasn't actually where I wanted it. It looked like what I externally referenced to determine was to be wanted, not what I actually wanted. And we had a deep connection like in the relationship, but I was still in some ways status seeking by externally referencing what I ought to want and then manifesting it. And the companies in a sense were that as well. And I didn't really know what I wanted, what my favorite color was or anything. So I stopped injecting that week. And I noticed in my meditations, my HRV scores, my heart rate variability started going up. And my body, that week of no hormones. It's like, that's interesting. So I didn't do it the next week and the next week and the next week. And my biometrics started stabilizing. I started feeling less stressed. I started feeling like this unfamiliar calmness that was actually scary in some ways. And I decided that I didn't decide to like stop doing gender in that sense, stop doing trans woman. I decided to stop doing biomedical. And I decided to sell my house and dissolve my companies. It basically pause button on my life. And I went to Indonesia, met up with a spiritual elder there, and he got clear that I had no idea what I wanted. I'd only externally referenced everything. And the question of what do you want to do right now got me. So I've said this before, like I wanted to go on a motorcycle and just go around all of Bali. And he just blessed that. Go do that right now. So I started riding, and that took me on many adventures and took me to the Amazon, the Ashaninka, the Awanawa. And then I found coaches who were like, what if money wasn't an issue? What would you really want to do? And I said, I wanted to be this super solutionary thinking for civilization designers. I wanted to build impact investing strategies that really change the world. And he said, do that, right? Do that. And I started like, what would that look like? I found people like Lucian Tarnowski. I found Jamie Wheel. I found some of these family offices that actually have massive intergenerational wealth and are trying to do good. And I started realizing that if I changed my frequency and had conviction and actually making a difference in the world, why not me? And that's when the fund of funds had a whole strategy. And then my startup strategy around an impact fund just was able to pollinate that vehicle. And we set off with that. So the detransition was essentially stopping everything and then going into spiritual process, death processes, doing the Sundance, et cetera. And then realizing that if I don't think about gender, what I naturally want to do is what you see right now. I actually really like this aesthetic. I really like this look. Whether it's a man or a woman, doesn't matter. But to be accurate with language, this is a man. I'm a man. And
Yeah.
to be accurate in my integrity, I was unconsciously running away from the responsibility of being a man in the world. And now I'm directly taking on that responsibility of being a man in the world. Right. And that is like the ultimate. I decided that my father had been digging the well for generations, and before him, the other men, and now I'm picking up a shovel and joining in the work. Right. That's men's work. And then just to wrap it into the professional expression, when I look around, like I have so many different startups, like I always wanted to build these cool jewelry, maybe a fashion brand, all this cool stuff. But I'm actually really good with frontier technology, and I'm very connected. And I've got some opportunities to really bring in the mystic, the dualism of the mystic and the operational, right? The scientific mystic. This is deep tech innovation. And I told you before the call that I'm in a conversation with a publicly traded clean tech research entity to commercialize some of their technologies. And this feels like this is real work that needs to be done that will change energy, that will change how power is produced commercially, residentially, and municipal level. And this is a real industry. It's going to make real impact. And I feel really activated on this. I also am helping Jamie with Flow Genome bring on enterprise clients, and that feels really clear, right? So this is the embodiment journey has allowed me to deeply discern where I was maybe running towards excitement, or where I could actually be still and realize, what do I want? What am I good at? What does the world need? Right? And what can I make a career out of? And I believe I found that with emergent intelligence. So I hope that kind of brings things together a bit.
Yeah, that was wonderful. Kind of like nice, subtle, like sliding ikigai in there at the end.
Yeah.
And I'd love to talk to you more about emergent intelligence, and but kind of frame that up a little bit. So what is your take or sense of the current landscape, say modernity or the Anthropocene, the kind of moment of humanity as it stands in 2023, transitioning into 2024, entering the age of AI, the front end of the age of AI already, and entering the age of the machine world, all the robots that are coming, as well as manufacturing humanoid robots, which is probably going to outpace their production of cars. And the cars are going to be driverless anyways, so they're basically robots anyways. So basically, like we're moving into a weird time, probably a somewhat of a post-truth moment as soon as, the deep fakes and the AI entities swarming the internet kind of like make people lose their frame of what's up and down, what's real. So like what's your sense of kind of the landscape? You can, what meta crisis frame if you want, however you want to frame it up. And then we'll talk about kind of like uh the path forward and kind of how you see humans in general, people who are live players who are trying to step into the infinite game and create and orient to a more beautiful world.
I love it. Well, the more beautiful world is possible, right? Chris, what's the Charles Eisenstein, or Our Hearts Know Is Possible. And it's great seeing Charles Eisenstein talk with Daniel Schmachtenberger, because you have this macro thinker.
Wait, when did that happen?
When I listened to that podcast when I was in Bali, actually, not too long after that motorcycle ride. I remember I think I was on the bike listening to like Daniel Schmachtenberger and Charles Eisenstein debating. And solid one. I think it's on Charles's podcast, actually.
Okay, I need to find that.
Yeah,
I somehow missed that, which is funny because those are two of my favorite thinkers.
And they're different. And they the whole first 20 minutes was like, man, I have a different approach than you. and Charles is like, I know, your heart, Daniel. And then Daniel's like, mind.
Yeah.
And it was beautiful. And I think one day I have a bit of a dream to get people like that in a movement-based podcast where we can be moving and talking and just to see what happens. Like, can you imagine getting a Tim Ferriss podcast where we're like moving while we're podcasting, or getting a Daniel Schmachtenberger? Yeah, bookmark. But my frame around the sense making in this space, I think there's some good thought work already in science fiction. So Isaac Asimov has the Foundation series, and I'm watching that again because they just released second season somewhere over the summer, and I just figured I'd get a free trial at Apple TV and check it out. I highly encourage people to do it because he's talking about this dynasty that's the empire is a cloned ruler. They decant every generation. They have this clone, and then his wife is a AI robot. Right? And then all of human civilization across the cosmos is ruled by this union. So there's so much metaphor and narrative. And then the predictive analyst, the mathematician scientist who builds this, he has an insight that there's going to be a civilization collapse, a dark age, and he wants to shorten the dark age by building a foundation, hence the film's title. And
just an arc of all human wisdom so that they can reboot
exactly.
fast.
Exactly. So if, for example, Earth was colliding through the cosmos towards an asteroid field in the next couple hundred years, and people may be talking about that or may not, I don't confirm nor deny, then maybe it's time to start stacking rocks, because language is place-based. Like, language and meaning only have integrity with a location. You go somewhere else and the words have a slightly different meaning. Go to a different time, you have a different epoch or a cataclysm, and those words almost have no meaning. But geometry, as the Pythagoreans understood, is axiomatic. And there's deep truth in the triangle, circle, and square. So why not encode all of human knowledge in the geometry of some big old pile of rocks in the middle of a desert in Egypt or in China somewhere, as maybe our ancestors did? So it's an ultimate durable textbook. And this concept is explored in the Foundation as to what might we do if we were faced with another similar
Are you alluding to the fact that potentially those ancestors were part of some sort of legacy civilization that potentially fell, and that the story of history is actually kind of built on sand?
What? No, the narratives are powerful. The stories are powerful, and ideological diversity. We can have a whole podcast about that. But I think there's a lot of evidence that says Younger Dryas extinction event. There were advanced civilizations. I don't think that they had cell phones though. So like, I think we are advanced, if you want to go into Atlantean, Lemurian speculations or different, as indigenous lineages, songs will often point towards brothers in the sky, right? Living music passed through direct transmission will point to some of the legitimacy of these cosmic relatives. Then maybe we can acknowledge that we have history and acknowledge that we also have value in this expression. So don't romanticize the Lemurians and the Arcturians. Don't romanticize the indigenous. Like, we all have something of value to contribute to the conversation, but hold on loosely. We don't know it all by definition. When we scale up past Dunbar's number, right, we have biases at scale too. So I hold only my frame is really only applied in my immediate relationships. When it comes to institutional scale and wayfinding as a civilization, it has to be in discourse and community. It has to be in consensus. So I think that is my answer to your question of like how to navigate the future. It's being really honest as to what is the market or the community, the culture actually doing diagnostically, despite what I can see and sense into the future. So always checking. Like, I may think that there's a cabal, or a lot of people choke on red pills, and they may think that there's a unethical or malintended collusion. But as we've discussed before, that could also be just the gaps in intention that scale up and then we personify, i.e. this Moloch concept of unconsciousness. And that may be more likely and rational than saying there's a negative organization of colluding actors. There might just be a gap in well-intentioned individuals that looks like a group of people. So I'm always checking myself for my biases. And I'm always looking at, well, what if I'm wrong? What if putting a Neuralink chip in allows me to navigate psychological volatility and stay in a more coherent or homeostatic psychology? And what if it's actually better for our species to have that regulator? And what if we actually are done with the crucibles of the highs and lows of human psychology? What if we're ready to actually be a more stable species and then emerge into an even more refined civilization where there's subtler still present volatilities to navigate and eat and refine. I know a lot of people say that if we were to have everybody on psychiatric medications, we would lose the lows and the highs. We'd all become kind of boring. And the same thing with the Neuralink. People are saying, oh, if you just artificially stabilize your psychology with some neural implant, then we're all going to become kind of boring. But I would challenge that and say, we don't actually know that. What if everybody's on this automated bespoke genetic therapy where they can live as long as they want, and they have this digital connectivity that's relatively neuromorphic, or we're cybernetically enhanced. And then there are even more subtle things to discern and refine and put our human consciousness towards exploring. Like we don't know. We don't know enough to label it bad or construct badness around it. And then it's real, okay, but we then also say, do we want that? Would that feel good? And from the trans experience, I know that the technology was not mature enough and was sold as complete sexual transformation, but was actually delivered as castration. So the technology, the real honest look at the technology, how mature is this? Can we really do what we think we can? Right? Are cell phones really connecting us, or are they disconnecting us in some ways?
Yeah, well said. Well said. I think that on that note, like where are we at currently? And I think that there's so much right now, or the state of our species there seems to be a lot of hubris. And and I think it comes from this, like, to circle back to pyramids and Younger Dryas impact hypothesis or whatever, like just the history books. I think part of the reason there's so much hubris is because we're all growing up in this zeitgeist, this paradigm that humanity's on this sort of upward trajectory of path of progress. And that, stone tools and like coming out of the Stone Age and coming out of like basically primitive apes, and then just like clawing our way out of the darkness, right? And domesticating fire and like tool use, and then eventually this revolution with agriculture, which leads to a rapid explosion of population and advancement, right? From this kind of Malthusian perspective of man, this sort of nasty, brutish, short, horrific kind of life, climbing our way up gradually and then rapidly to kind of like where we're at now, which is like, stewarding the power of God, so nuclear energy and artificial intelligence and all of the rest. So I want to question that paradigm a little bit, because there's a couple good reasons to. One is, those pyramids you mentioned, which are there. So it's not just the song lines and the storytelling coming through indigenous societies, it's the literal fucking structures that exist in the world that are kind of problematic, right? They're problematic structures that shouldn't quite be there, given the story, given the narrative, right? Like you can't cut through limestone blocks that are 100 tons, thousands of tons with a bronze saw. And then you can't do that for 2 million fucking tons or 2 million blocks and then stack them on top of each other in perfect geometry, aligned to true north, and all the different mathematical, components that are coded in there. Like the mysteries of that one structure defy all logic and defy the narrative, at least, of the Bronze Age sort of story.
For sure. I think that we're retroactively trying to understand what they were capable of, and maybe give them more credit. So this, in science, we can go to replication, verification, falsifiability as a scientific method. But in music, we can make amazing sounds and sonic sound healing with precision, like an Icaro, or like an Indian sound, like a true indigenous sound healing with singing bowls. And those things could be surgically precise. So
100%.
maybe with a tuning based epistemology that was able to reach levels of efficacy that we can't even approach today. Maybe they were tuning into the rock or tuning into the water and doing things that we can't do today.
No, yeah. I would be totally open to any of those hypotheses. I think that's stretching the Western paradigm, right? Already. I mean, we're finally catching up to that with, the science kind of around harmonics and stuff, and like people starting to like actually do some pretty interesting stuff with it. But yeah, there's this mystery is all I'm trying to say. And there's also clear evidence of catastrophic damage to the planet 12,000 years ago, which is, if you just deduce from that, okay, so 12,000 years ago, sea levels go up 400 feet, and you have all this die-off of species in North America, these massive animals that are all gone, like 30 different species of megafauna or whatever it is, and, death of the Clovis culture, and all these different things pointing to, it's a really bad time in the the record, the ice core samples holding the record, and the soil samples holding the record, the archaeological record, right? And the impact proxies of high impact melt glass and nanospherules that form under incredible amounts of pressure and heat,
Yeah.
that are associated with nuclear test sites or impacts, because it just requires a ton of energy to create. And we're starting to put together a picture now of like, fuck, this was a huge event that was global, and put Earth into a 1600-year period of darkness. And there's coincidentally a mythology in almost every single culture that tells a story of this deluge and this pretty hardcore time, of kind of the reboot of Earth. And then, the underground cities in Turkey and Göbekli Tepe and all of the shit that's like coming out now around that. So there's just evidence starting to stack up. So the reason I'm saying all this is because, Jamie says like history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, right? And so if we change the story, if we change our narrative, our paradigm of like, we're just on this path of progress and everything's getting better perpetually, then maybe we'll start to have less hubris and a little bit more of humility around the fact that, fuck, we kind of have hung on by a thread multiple times as a species. Volcanoes in Indonesia, Younger Dryas 12,000 years ago, we've had some genetic bottlenecks, and we've had some pretty hardcore travesties that our ancestors have actually, blessed their souls. Shout out to the ancestors who have survived that and given us the chance to even be here. And I think also, if you want to take a little bit more of the woo perspective and the idea, I mean, I don't know how woo this really is. I just don't think there's enough science to back it up. But the idea that like our genetics actually holds that memory, and that DNA is sort of a mystery, and most of DNA is actually unmapped. And the fact that like all those ancestors passed on that DNA. And so there's a genetic signature of a really traumatic, of really all that memory. And, I think that when you shift that paradigm, the way that you approach modern man and the modern age starts to look a lot different. And yeah, now you're starting to think about like, oh shit, so we're not untouchable. And in fact, this is temporary. By definition, it's
We
probably
can do it again, right? Temporary, but not doom and gloom. Like the codes to do this can express again. Like there was a Kogi elder at Aniwa gathering this past summer, and people were asking him, what about like the war in Russia and Ukraine? And he was like, don't worry, like we know how to turn this off and turn it back on, right? We don't forget. And he's the Kogi are an indigenous tribe up in the mountains. Where are they? Peru? Yeah, and we can check that later. They were all white.
they're in Colombia, I think.
Colombia, that's right, Colombia. Yeah, and they just meditate and work with La Luna, which is the energy grids of the planet. And he was really speaking from experience, is what I felt. Like
The Kogi are fascinating because they're like the one indigenous society in South America that didn't get wiped out by the conquistadores. So like they retreated up into the Sierra Nevada and were actually able to keep their culture intact.
Exactly. And for that reason, when he said that, like, don't worry, we can turn this off and turn it back on. It felt like he knew what he was doing. And I spoke with my Mayan elders and my Sundance, and they say the Mayans didn't go extinct. They just paused being Mayan, and they started being whatever the other cultures were around them. And because they'd done everything. They gave their young ones to sacrifice. They fasted. They prayed. And there was a big famine happening, and the droughts and things. And they just, okay, we're going to stop doing what we do for a minute. And they're totally able to turn that back on at the right signal. So I think there's a lot of technology there that we don't necessarily remember in the mass population. But when I look at some of the people who, and I'm mindful of time, this has been a lot, but I do have to have another thing to get to in a little bit. But there's another mentor of mine. His name is Shen Tong. He was really instrumental in the Tiananmen Square uprisings, and then he built his wealth with food accelerators to elevate human consciousness by how we relate to the land and how we relate to our bodies. really interesting character, but he was just at a longevity conference, and all the scientists were kind of biohacking their way to health span or even extending lifespan. And he's a spiritual seeker out there doing all the sacred sites and ancient indigenous ceremonies. And his biomarkers of youth were he was the winner. So against all like the people spending millions on longevity, he was sitting there praying and singing and using his body, and he had reversed his age. His hair is vital. His eyes, he doesn't wear contacts anymore, and through the woo woo, quote unquote. So yeah, we're definitely remembering. I've also got a scientist at a Hong Kong Polytechnic Institute, Dr. Gino Yu, close to the founding of TED, and knows Richard Wurman and those guys. And he studies non-ordinary consciousness and fundraises for these institutions to validate mystics, basically. So transpersonal psychology and the methods of action. So how does a shaman heal someone? They like research the brain states, the mirror neuron, the resonance entrainment, and then the processes of synchronizing energy and catalyzing healing in someone remotely. And then there's so much research on remote viewing. A lot of stuff right now in the UAP space and non-human intelligence space that has real economic impact on the commercialization of in these research arms. Like these defense contractors, private entities have a lot of have biologics, right? This is public knowledge, and biologics are essentially like metals that exhibit properties of being alive in some sense, or gravitational anomalies. And they've been studying to reverse engineer and then commercialize these technologies for the defense sector primarily. And now there's been legislation of eminent domain for the U.S. government, so the U.S. government's going to be seizing a lot of these specimens, and therefore the market advantage needs to be realized now, or the government's going to have it. So we're seeing a lot of in the private equity and institutional fundraising space around these new IP, new intellectual property in the defense sector being pushed out now. This is like radar and propulsion systems and different materials that have different properties. And I think this is no longer science fiction. I think this is very having a real world measurable effect on markets and then culture. So I think it's no longer as socially expensive to talk about these things.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, things are changing really rapidly, really fast, and you might the term red pill is almost becoming like a like a watered down thing that it doesn't mean anything anymore, because there's so many happening. Like just constantly things are breaking down, and people are taking red pills left and right around dispelling all kinds of status quo. But okay, so how much time do you got? So I don't speak too.
So I've got a call in 10 minutes, at 5:15. It's with another flow genome brother.
Nice.
I could even WhatsApp and asking for 5 maybe.
Okay, well, I don't want to. Yeah, we'll wrap it. But I guess we're not going to be able to finish the thread in 10, so we'll leave a cliffhanger. But basically, what I want to talk to you about next is, given the uncertainty and the rapid rate of change, the exponential rate of change that we're moving into with the age of AI, how can people actually orient themselves? You know what I mean? And it's almost like, on the one hand, there's this, excitement about the possibility space, but on the other hand, there's also a terrible amount of grief and stuff to process, right? Around just when you kind of snap online and you realize both the state of the world and where we came from, and the amount of just tragedy. And you mentioned colonialism earlier, the genocides and the ecocide that's taking place on the planet, the state of the state of the waters, the state of the species, just all of the ways you can measure sort of the wound that we've sort of the wounding that we've sort of wreaked on if that's the right word, on the planet. We've really wreaked havoc on the planet in lots of ways. And so the sort of pre-tragic, tragic, post-tragic frame of, okay, first I was thinking of this as everything's good, and now we're on this story of progress, and then I maybe wake up with a whimper to the fact that shit, this is actually pretty rough, what's going on. most places and globally what's happening. And also turns out that no one seems to know where the brakes are. And we kind of have this Moloch dynamic playing out, this
Yeah.
unconscious coordination failure.
Yeah, I agree. There's coordination failure, and I think and I think there's a lot of the expression of unconscious intention or Moloch. I think that the grounding for me is remembering where attention goes, energy flows. And
Yeah.
I'm not spreading myself out. Doesn't mean I'm not aware of those things, but my information diet is intentional. So I'm tuning my reality to more of that. I'm referencing myself off of the things that I want more of, and then intentionally the things that I want to have polarity to, repulsion or attraction. So I'm using my attention very, very intentionally,
Yes.
and I think that's so critical right now. Right when
Yes.
this first became very real for me was the beginning of the pandemic, where the world was collapsing, and then I realized when I could calibrate my attention, I could actually tune into some really amazing communities and then go deeper there.
Yeah.
And the same applies even more so now. Like we can always find something to doom scroll on, some new insight, new rabbit hole. But if you consume expansive content at all times, we struggle to integrate it. So knowing the rhythm of consumption versus expression and having time every day to write, process, and also to be still and meditate and receive, and then to consume content in the afternoons, right? And to have awesome conversations in the afternoons or as the sun is setting here, right? Understanding those rhythms
Yeah.
is the most important thing for me to navigate this.
Yeah, well said. And what Jamie's doing with Flow Genome and training with him and I echo that sentiment. Where your attention goes is absolutely vital. It's the only thing that you can really control. And most people are out of control with their attention, right? And like
Mm.
kind of just sucked in and bouncing around wherever the algorithm takes them. So it's it's the Wild West out there. But Soul Quest is actually my attempt at sort of trying to synthesize and create as sort of an expression of art a synthesis of my perspective and the wisdom that I've been able to kind of encounter in my short amount of time on this planet and create an 80-20 formula to kind of get that focus back, focus on the shit that actually matters, light up, boot up, right? Like become a live player. In other words, an architect and a creator, somebody who's intentionally creating their reality and level up and increase your capacity to do that. And then show up, bring your art to the world and your authentic creative expression, your ikigai to the collective. So that's kind of the really, really short, high level version. We didn't really have enough time to unpack it, but maybe another day.
Oh, 100% another day. I think that this is our conversations, I think, are really important. I've said this before, brother. You're an amazing thinker, and the architecture of conversations is actually really discernible, and I think is just has a lot of integrity for folks to then relate to and understand. Okay, this new topic is coming in, but I understand where it fits. So if we're comparing maps, right, those who are good at making maps should rise in the meritocracy to serve others, right?
Mm.
And a lot of people are in need of new updates to their maps right now.
Yeah. Not just the map, but the compass. In other words, what are you orienting to in the first place, and how do you navigate that map? And what's your true north? What's the thing what's your orienting principle? What's your light that you're orienting your life towards? That's an important question. I think it's time that we start asking it.
100%, 100%. Well, yeah, this is amazing. I feel like
Yeah,
my brain has expanded and then grounded as it always does in conversation with you. So
yeah,
thank you so much.
I love these dialogues always, and looking forward to keeping it going, man. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for your time.